Our offering, I think that was called Indescribable. Thou art an amazing God, is what some of the lyrics are. Powerful song and very meaningful for what we'll be looking at today. Our scripture reading, if you'd like to follow along, is in your bulletin. Excerpts from chapter 1 of Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. We skip over the names. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. So God was kind to the midwives. The people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. You ever gone into a room and couldn't remember why you went? For you, does the phrase get lucky mean that you remembered where you parked your car at the hospital or the shopping mall? You find yourself still writing 2015 or maybe 2014 on your checks this morning? If so, you have had some minor memory issues. Well, this morning, we're going to look at starting the book of Exodus. And surprisingly, Exodus is a book about memory. We start out finding out that the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, does not remember Joseph. We find out that the Hebrews do not remember God. And so, which is worse? That Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph and that the Hebrews are an asset? Or that the Hebrew people collectively forget their memory of who God is, who they are, and what their purpose is. So that's part of what we will be looking at today. But here's what Exodus is really all about. Most of the time when we think of Exodus, we think that it is a book about God delivering the Hebrews out of bondage. It's not. What it's really about is that God is bringing the Hebrews up to the promised land. Because we are told that God remembers his covenant to Abraham and brings the Hebrews up out of the bondage that they are in into the promised land to fulfill the covenant that he had made with Abraham. Chapter 1 sets the stage for us. There are three issues that happen in chapter 1. Fertility, fear, faithfulness. Chapter 1 sets the stages for what is happening here. When we left off, if you remember, no pun intended, when we left off, Joseph has just brought his family into Egypt. We are in the second year of a 7-year drought that is devastating the ancient Near East. And so Joseph has brought his father Jacob and all of his brothers, and they are dwelling in the region of Goshen, which is in the northeast corner of the Nile Delta. Now, what is interesting about this is that there are 75 people. That's all. Now, this is amazing to me because in the 300 years between Abraham and Joseph, there are 75 Hebrews. That's pathetic. God said that they were to be numerous, they were to be fruitful, and they were to multiply, that he was going to make of Abraham a great nation. In 300 years, we have 75 people. In Genesis, the problem was infertility. You have Sarah and Rachel and Rebekah who had great difficulty having children. But now when we get to Exodus, we go to a different problem, in that the problem is not infertility, but the problem is too much fertility. Now, we are told that 600,000 men leave Egypt when the Exodus actually happens. That's only counting men who are between the ages of 20 and 45, fighting age. So you actually are looking at the smallest crowd of either 2 million to upwards of 5 million. In the same time period of 300 years, where Abraham and his descendants have 75, the Hebrews now go from 75 to 5 million. Now, I did the math on that. That's 12 generations. That means every girl had to average at least 5 surviving live births. There evidently were not very many Rachels or Sarahs or Rebeccas during that time period. And so the Egyptians become overwhelmed. They become frightened by what they are seeing. Now, here's the point, okay? I've said this almost in every book that we study, and I will probably say it for every book that we study. All right? Exodus is written for us, but what? It's not written to us. And so when we read Exodus, I like what Kurt says when I tell this thing. He says that the ancient world, when they looked at the moon, they said, gee, isn't that beautiful? But we look at the moon and we say, how many pounds of rocket thrust does it need for us to get there? And so when we read Exodus, what are we concerned about? We want to know the date, when it happened. We want to know how they went from 600, from 75 to 5 million. We want to know why there's only 2 midwives mentioned, if there's that many, people that are being born. We get all concerned about numbers, dates, and places. The ancient readers of this book, when they first heard the stories, those questions never even occurred to them. The idea that the date as to when the Exodus could have happened, Moses could have told us the name of the Pharaoh that he was dealing with when he wrote Exodus. He tells us the name of the 2 midwives. In chapter 6, he gives us his genealogy, but he never tells us who the Pharaoh is so that we can identify which dynasty it is and which date it is, whether it's an early date of 530 BCE or 1260 BCE. You know why? It's because the date's not important. What's important is that God remembered his covenant, and he delivered them. They don't care when the date was. We get all concerned about the people. How do you go to 5 million people? Do you realize that if you're marching 5 million people out of Egypt, do you realize that that would be a column a half a mile wide that would stretch from Benton to Kichai with only a yard or 2 between you? Can you imagine trying to march a column 10 miles long, a half a mile wide? You'd have to march 11 miles just for the last group to get to where you left. We get all concerned about that. How could they have done that? Is that even possible? You know what the ancient Hebrews thought? God remembered all of his people. He remembered all of his people so that all of them came out. So we get bent out of shape about the wrong stuff. That's not what's important. God is at work. So now, the ancient Hebrews, they weren't concerned about numbers, but Pharaoh was. Pharaoh became terrified because of the number of Hebrews, because of their fertility. And so what we are told here is that Pharaoh does not remember Joseph. Now, when you read this in the Hebrew language, this can be interpreted two different ways. It could be one is that Pharaoh literally did not remember Joseph, that 200, 300 years has passed by, and he literally has forgotten him, and that the Hebrew people were an asset, and that Joseph had saved the nation from this terrible drought. But there's also the possibility that the numbers of the Hebrews were so great that he became fearful of them, and so he intentionally forgot Joseph because he was afraid of what they might do to his reign. So does fertility lead to fear, or does fear lead to fertility? We're not sure. I guess does the forgetfulness lead to the fear? Does the fear lead to the forgetfulness? And it doesn't matter. All we know is that Pharaoh is frightened. So in the interest of national security, he begins to make some horrible, horrible decisions. So what he tries to do is he tries to enslave the Hebrews. Now, one of the things that we wonder about is if they're so numerous, why didn't they just leave? If the Hebrews outnumbered the Egyptians, why didn't they just get up and go? Why didn't they fight? Why didn't they do anything? It's because we're already given the answer in Genesis. In chapter 15 of Genesis, this is what God says to Abraham. He says, "Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and they shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years." How long were the Hebrews in Egypt? 400 years. They will be there for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. The amazing thing to me when I read this is that when the Hebrews forgot God, even when they were being enslaved and oppressed, they never cried out to God. We read that they cry out, but they never direct their cry to God. They have forgotten him. Not only has Pharaoh forgotten Joseph, what's even worse is that the people have forgotten God. But what this is telling us, and what we're going to look at here in just a little bit, is that this bondage in Egypt served a purpose. God brought his people into Egypt in order that he might bring them out of Egypt into the promised land. And while they were in Egypt, their bondage served a purpose in preparing them to be his people to dwell in the promised land. Bondage serves a purpose. Pharaoh forgot Joseph. The Hebrews forgot God. The Hebrews never attempted to leave, or they even cried out to God. But at the right time, God remembers his covenant. Raises up Moses to bring his people not just out of Egypt, but bring them up into the promised land. That leads to the third thing that happens here, and that is faithfulness. Fear leads to 3 pogroms. The first pogrom was to enslave the Hebrews. And so they begin to enslave the Hebrews. They make them build these storage cities. They have to make their bricks. They have to build roads. They're building irrigation ditches and pumping all the water. And the purpose for the enslavement is to control the population. They're also hoping that it will kill off most of the men. And if it doesn't kill off most of the men, they hope that they're so exhausted that they can't go home and make babies with their wives. And so that was the first thing. And what do we find out is it failed miserably. And that the Hebrews were even more numerous. And they were more fruitful. And so then Pharaoh gets the midwives. And we mentioned these two midwives. He gets these two midwives. And again, we get all concerned about the midwives. Because there's only two. And we wonder, if there's only two, how in the world do two midwives deal with what would be anywhere, from 2 or 3 million women? How in the world do they deal with them? That's a question that we ask. You know what the ancient Hebrews were thinking when they read this? Not only are the men overworked, but so are the midwives. But the point is that Pharaoh is trying to enlist the Hebrews to kill their own babies. So he gives them an order that when you see that they're about to have a baby and you get called in, if it's a baby boy, kill him. But let the girls live. And then the third pogrom is later when when that fails miserably, tells all of his people that if you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw him into the Nile, drown him. Now, we start to wonder, why would he let the girls live? Ever wonder that? Why does he let the girls live? Because if you really wanted to eliminate the population, who would you kill? Kill the girls, not the boys. What is probably happening here is that one reason why you would kill the boys is they are the ones most likely to be able to rebel and fight against you. But why he probably lets the girls live is that Pharaoh desires the women. He wants to turn the fertility of the Hebrew women to an advantage for his people. He wants to enslave the Hebrew women and make them wives to the Egyptians, concubines to the Egyptians, so that his nation might be fruitful. Some of the evidence for this is that later when Moses confronts Pharaoh, and he says, "Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we might sacrifice." Pharaoh agrees on the condition that only the men go and the women and the livestock stay behind. What was of value to Pharaoh? The women and the livestock. He most likely was going to attack the men as soon as they left. The last thing is that the word Pharaoh is not a name. It's a title that literally means great house. What Pharaoh is attempting to do is to build a great house of having many people. The way he wants to do this is by having lots and lots of children, and he sees the fertility of the Hebrew women as a way of doing that. But back to the story of Shiphrah and Puah. These two women, when Pharaoh tells them what he wants them to do, they refuse him. They don't do it. Now, why they don't do it is because we are told that they fear God. They fear judgment from God more than they fear judgment from Pharaoh. Now, this is amazing because they don't remember God either. And nowhere do we read that they had a vision or a dream or something from God telling them not to do this. But they evidently retain just enough memory that they realize that there is a God and that what Pharaoh is asking them to do is wrong. And so they refuse to do it. When Pharaoh finds out about this, he brings these midwives in and he says, "Why didn't you do what I told you to do?" And so they either lie or they tell him a partial truth. And we didn't read this part, but what they say is that the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. That's true. He says that they are more vigorous than the Egyptian women. Now, that word vigorous in the Hebrew has two different meanings to it. One of them is the Hebrew women are more vigorous than the Egyptian women and that they're healthier. They're more vital. So that when it's time for them to give birth, they give birth quickly and they don't need any help, which would be a compliment. But the word vigorous can also be translated as wild animals. The Hebrew women are like rabbits. They don't have children, they have litters. They are so numerous that, there isn't anything we can do. They just pop out. And so, and that's a slam. That's a criticism. Pharaoh most likely hears it as the Hebrew women are like wild rabbits and that they cannot be controlled. So he becomes even more frightened, and he says, and now we need to throw all of the baby boys into the Nile River and drown them. Now, what's interesting about this is these midwives, they don't save the baby boys for any sort of a reward, but they get a reward. And that God blesses them, and they become leaders or have great houses. Now, in the Hebrew language is absolutely delightful because of the puns and the words that rhyme and the things. And so when we read this in the English, we don't get the irony in the puns. So I kind of rewrote it a little bit to emphasize those. This isn't a literal translation by any means. It's a paraphrase. But the Pharaoh means great house or baby maker. So here's what the Hebrew writer is telling us. He says, this big baby maker enlists the helpers of those who have babies to kill the babies. The helpers refuse, and as a result, the big baby maker acts like a baby, and the helpers end up becoming big baby makers themselves. You catch the irony in the pun that is actually in the Hebrew as to what's going on. Pharaoh is being frustrated. And there isn't anything that he can do about it because God is at work. This isn't Pharaoh's doing. It's God who's at work. So here's the implications that I see for us. Some of these are going to be some meddling here a little bit. Is that one of the questions we ask is, why didn't Israel cry out to God? And it's because their bondage actually serves a purpose. And that God remembers his covenant. And the bondage was preparing Israel to be a great nation. Their suffering was strengthening them and hardening them so that when they came back into the promised land, they would be the nation that God wanted them to be. To Abraham, he says, I shall be your God, you shall be my people, and I will dwell in your midst, and I will give you this land. So that bondage, that suffering, actually was serving a purpose. The implication for us is that can we have the long view? When we suffer, when we face hardship, when we face disappointment, can we see it as that maybe God is trying to work something in our life in order to develop us, to perfect us, because he has something in mind for us, purpose? See, sometimes the losses and hurts that we suffer today just might be the paving stone of tomorrow's victory. That's hard to hear. Second, fear can lead to regrettable decisions. Here's where I'm going to do some meddling. Is our current political climate is based on fear. We're afraid. We have one political candidate who says that he's going to build a wall to keep all the Latinos out. He doesn't trust them, thinks that they're all criminals, rapists, doesn't want them in our country. We have a refugee crisis in Europe because an Islamic country is in tremendous turmoil because of a nut job there. People are terrified because of ISIS and other things to allow these Muslim refugees into their country. We could build walls to keep everybody out. Right now we would. Our nation, we are giving up our freedoms and our privacy because we are afraid of terrorists, ISIS. We are making regrettable decisions that are becoming public policy. I hope I'm not stepping on toes. And I realize I'm naive. Part of the government's job is to protect its citizens. One of the things that I know about what God said to the Hebrews is after he brought them out of Egypt, and they were dwelling in the land, what he says to them is that show compassion to the alien and the sojourner among you, because you were once aliens and sojourners in Egypt. God still says that to us today. We have amnesia. We have forgotten that we are a nation of immigrants, aliens, sojourners. What's on our Statue of Liberty? Give me those who are oppressed, downtrodden. We right now are allowing fear to turn us into a nation that is turning its back on people who are suffering because of national security. Third, Pharoh was aborting babies. Partial birth abortion. The baby would be delivered as soon as you could identify it was a boy. The midwives were expected to strangle them, to kill them. And later they were throwing them into the Nile River, at least trying to do something like that. In our society today, we have taken abortion and we've sanitized it. We've given it this nice word called choice. I don't know what your political leanings are on that. I have a hard time thinking of any reason why an abortion is justified. I realize that there are times when maybe if the woman's health is such that, that having to make a really difficult choice between her life or the baby's life. When you look at the breakdown of the numbers as the reasons given for an abortion, it says that 1% is because of rape, 3% is because of the health of the mother, 4% is because of the fetal health concerns. They didn't think the baby was going to make it. That's 8%. That means 92% of all abortions, the reason that they are being done is mainly for the convenience of the mother or the father or the family. And that they don't want to afford it. They don't want to deal with it. So they take a life. And we just turn a blind eye. We just say, it's a choice. In China, abortion is used to control their population and for gender selection. One of the things that most people aren't aware of is that Margaret Sanger, who is the one who founded Planned Parenthood, was a racist. She started Planned Parenthood because she saw it as a means of controlling the black population. She was in favor of forced abortions for blacks. In our society today, white women have the most abortions, numbers-wise. But percentage-wise of race, blacks abort more of their babies than any other nationality. That's shameful. We turn a blind eye, call it choice. Fourth, here's the good news, though, is that there is a solution to it. Shiphrah and Puah feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They didn't have a dream. They didn't have a vision. God doesn't speak to them directly. God doesn't say, I'm going to reward you if you are faithful. But they feared God and knew that what they were doing was wrong. And so they stood up to Pharaoh. And they refused to do what he commanded them to do. Another word for faithfulness, courage. It's courage to do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't result in a reward. Sometimes it just ends up in isolation or you get martyred. That's where martyrs come from. People who are doing the will of God, being courageous, and their result is they die. But Shiphrah and Puah were willing to take that risk. Here's the message to our graduates and to all of us today, is that for our graduates, you're going to go off to college or you're going to enter into the workforce or the military or go off into the world, and you are going to find Pharaoh out there. You're going to find people who are going to tell you to go ahead and lie, go ahead and cheat. They're going to tell you that, you're going to have to make decisions about your morality, your sexuality, what you're going to do, how you're going to treat other people in the workplace and in school, whether you're going to cheat on time when you have opportunities to cheat, whether you're going to lie. What are you going to do? What are we going to do? Because we still face all of those same choices every day. We fear God more than we fear Pharaoh? Will we be courageous? Will we be faithful? Will we make the right choice?